back, everybody. It's February 15th. It's a Tuesday, and hope everyone had a good Valentine's Day. And it looks like we're about to get some snow in Crested Butte, so that's a good sign as well. I am Ashley O'Hara, the curator here at the Crested Butte Museum, for those of you who don't know. And welcome back to our series with Duane. This rendition will be Crested Butte history. He has done a series, so this is kind of like a second part series of Crested Butte history. First episode. As in prior episodes, I do want to give a land acknowledgement, just a reference to where we are. The museum recognizes that we're guests here on this land, historically Ute territory. We acknowledge the Uncompahgre Ute, formerly known as the Tabewash. They were forcibly removed from this area due to the Brno Treaty in 1868, and we hope that you will take time to visit our neighbor down in Montrose, the Ute Museum through Colorado history. While we can never do this history justice, we do include information here at the museum about the Paleo Indians, the Los Pinos Indian Agency, and the Brno Treaty, and more. There are other ways to support Indigenous information and people of today in the past is to go beyond just a land acknowledgement that I'm giving here. You can do your own research of where you are. And yeah, next we'll get into, I hope we become, sorry, I need to slow down here. We hope that you will think about becoming a member of here at the museum. Memberships are $25. You can do that by visiting our website, crestedbuttemuseum.com. And on that website will be all of our events as well. Talking about events, right now we are offering our in-house interpretive tours Friday mornings at 10 a.m. here at the museum. And we're also going to have a historic cross-country ski with myself and others through the Crested Butte Nordic Center on March 17th. You can sign up through our website as well, or at the Nordic Center. This program is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube page in about 2 days or less. Currently, we have, let's see, I think that's about it. You can find us on Facebook and Instagram. And I just also want to give a thank you to our lead sponsors for this rendition. I want to thank you to Diane Woolery in honor of her brother, John Yankowicz, John Briggers Construction, as well as Kachevers. Without their sponsorships, this episode wouldn't be happening. And Duane, of course. So Duane, let's go.
Thank you, Ashley, and welcome everybody. It's good to be back, and it's good to have everybody on board. And as you can see, it's a real pleasure for me to be in the Crested Butte Museum. And behind me is the pot-bellied stove that Tony Mihelich and the old timers used to sit around and talk about different stories. So it's very nice to be here. The photograph that you're looking at right now is on Elk Avenue in 1882. I want to go through a couple of things before we get started. First of all, welcome everybody. We will be on from 6 o'clock to 7 o'clock the next 8 Tuesdays, 8 sessions. We'll have questions at the end, and we're also going to have a trivia question at the end, and I will, anybody that is the first to answer will get a copy of Around the Gunnison Country, one of the books that I've written. Certainly want to thank the sponsors and tell everybody that down the line, Bruce Bartleson will be on with me talking about geology of the Elk Mountains and Crested Butte. And Pete Dunda is going to be up here playing the accordion and doing a little polka music. Next week, we will be talking about what happened in Crested Butte and the north area of the Gunnison Country before there was a Crested Butte. Native American Ute Indians, Spanish, fur traders, explorers, placer miners, surveyors, and then came the people around 1879. I want to start off today by talking about a frontier, which Crested Butte really was in the early 1870s and the middle 70s. Now, the word frontier means many things. It's a boundary between countries. It's a line separating wilderness from settlement, and it's also a new and unexplored field. It also can be a state of mind, and that's how I'd like to open up my talk tonight. In the 1950s, one of the great historians of the American West, David Lavender, was in Telluride with Theodore Kreiber, one of the great anthropologists in the nation, who had written about the last surviving Digger Indian in California, Ishi, famous book. And they both grew up near Telluride in the San Miguel Valley. And Theodore Kreiber was reminiscing, and she said this: "In that thin, dry air, life moved at a pace of almost terrible intensity. There were no neutral moments, the galloping brevity of spring and summer, the long months of winter with the threat of tragedy always hovering near. Colors were high, the reds in the soil, the fall gold of the aspens, the indescribable sky. Riding in summer and tobogganing in winter were fast and dangerous. The heights of the mountains and the depths of the canyons were beyond the human norm. No wonder one went about totally sensitized. No wonder recovery for the elders was a trip to the coast and a youngster introversion. Get on your horse and ride until you looked out and down, tremendously out and down. God was a pagan god in the air, over the mountains, and in the waterfalls. But how can I give the feeling tone of my childhood in that high alpine valley, which simply is one of the most beautiful spots in the world?" And that's what we're talking about when we talk about the Slate River Valley and the great East River Valley around Crested Butte. Stunning in a state of mind. Arthur Chapman, a great writer for the Denver Post in 1888, kind of echoed what existed out here near Crested Butte in the West when he said, "Out where the hand clasp is a little stronger, out where the smile dwells a little longer, that's where the West begins. Out where the sun is a little brighter, where the bonds of home are a wee bit tighter, that's where the West begins." This area was a tough place to live in the early days, and a lot of people referred to it as the land of the hard way eight. You go on the crap tables in Las Vegas and you throw a couple of fours, and the odds are about 8-1. And that's about what they were against you when you came into this country in the 1870s. In 1881, a little girl was leaving her Kansas town heading for Crested Butte. And her parents said later on, she put her hands in the air, looked up into the sky and said, "Goodbye, God, I'm going to Crested Butte." There was a lot of truth in that. Robert Service in The Spell of the Yukon echoed a lot about what was going on here. "I have clinched and closed with the naked North. I've learned to defy and defend. Shoulder to shoulder, we have fought it out. Yet the wild must win in the end." And then there was the great freighter of the Western Slope, David Wood, who operated in the Gunnison country and around Montrose and Telluride. Accosted by a young lady near Telluride who said to him, "Sir, have you been in these parts very long?" And David Wood eyed her with contemptuous disdain and said, "Madam, I haul these damn mountains in here." Mark Twain also echoed a little bit about what was true about the north end of this valley when he said, "A mine is a hole in the ground owned by a liar." I believe that there's a great view of the meanders up the East River. And I believe that there have been 10 keys to the understanding of Crested Butte and the Gunnison country throughout the course of history. When this area opened up, it opened up with prehistoric people 10 to 12,000 years ago. And then a litany of people came through, Native American Ute Indians, and then came the Spanish, and then the fur traders, and then the explorers, and then the surveyors, and then the placer miners, and finally the lode miners who were engaged in silver mining. Looking backward, Crested Butte has experienced many changes and has gone through many periods of transition. But today, because of the increased population, problems in the cities, a lot more money, and the great beauty of the area, along with people being allowed to work from home, we are experiencing some of the greatest challenges we've ever had, one that could change the character of the region immeasurably. Here are the 10 keys that have impacted Crested Butte in the north end of the Gunnison country. One is geography. And one of the great statistics in Colorado is 10% of the population live on the western slope. 33% of the land area is western slope, and 80% of the water comes from the western slope. And therein lie many tales of woe. The water is where the people ain't, and the people ain't where the water is. There are 5 Colorados, really. The western slope, the San Luis Valley, the Front Range, the Eastern Plains, and Denver. And all are very important, and all are very suspicious of each other. Arnold Toynbee, the great English historian, once said that geography is the great lever of history. England, for instance, he said, was an island nation and couldn't produce everything it needed, so it had to have a great navy and get colonies. In Greece, it was very difficult to transport yourself in the early days through 25,000 square miles of one tangled mountain range after another. So Greece came up with city-states, independent city-states, like Athens and Sparta and Delphi and Corinth. And then Frederick Jackson Turner said that geography had a big impact on what made an American. An American, he said, was molded by the frontier, the presence of free land in the West. That made an American. So the cold, the isolation, the snow, and the elevation all have had great impacts on how Crested Butte would develop. The second key is water, the lifeblood of Crested Butte and the Gunnison country, the most cussed and discussed topic in Colorado and the West. The old saying is that whiskey is for drinking and water is for fighting. Governor John Love, water runs uphill towards money. There are 2 water rights that we have in the United States. One of them, east of the Mississippi River, is called the Doctrine of Riparian Rights, which says that everybody along a river can take water out of the river as it goes by his or her property. The only 2 exceptions are you can't take so much out that you stop steamboats from operating, and you can't take so much out that you stop mill wheels from operating. Well, I would suggest to all of you that if we're talking about steamboats and mill wheels, we are talking about tremendous rivers like the Mississippi and the Ohio and the Tennessee. And nobody's going to worry if you take a little water out of those big rivers as it goes by your property. However, in the West, we live in an arid desert, and that wasn't going to work. And very early, we adopted the doctrine of prior appropriation, which had 2 rules. Number 1, first in time, first in use. In other words, whoever has the best water rights, or the number 1 water right, is going to be the last person to go dry in a dry year. And secondly, use it or lose it. Nobody can hoard water in the West. And if you can't prove that you can use it, you got to give it up to somebody who can use it. Many people want water in Colorado and the West. And out here on the western slope around Crested Butte, we're going to have to fight to keep our water because Denver and the Front Range want it. And their motto is, what's mine is mine, and what's yours is negotiable. Water is the greatest asset that Crested Butte and the Gunnison country has. It'll be worth a lot more than any investment on the New York Stock Exchange as time goes by. The great fights in the future are going to be involved in the West involving water, with cities like Los Angeles and Lubbock and Las Vegas and Phoenix and Tucson. They need the water and they don't have it where they are. There's not enough water to go around and meet all the demands. 40 million people depend on water from the Colorado River. And in the future, there's going to be a great eastward movement as people will have to move out of the West and move to where the water is. Minnesota, Illinois, Iowa, Wisconsin. Economics will ultimately dictate where people live. When water rates go up to about $5,000 a month, people are not going to be able to live in an area they want to live in. And economics is the only thing that'll change it. The third major key are railroads, and there is the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad with a load of coal in the 1880s and the Crested Butte Depot on the left. Without the coming of railroads, Crested Butte would have remained an isolated wilderness. The arrival of the Denver and Rio Grande in November of 1881 in Crested Butte and the Denver, South Park, and Pacific up near the head of Ohio Creek in 1882 gave ranchers and miners and farmers an outlet and brought supplies into the people. And I want to mention that prior to coming of the railroads, everybody had to be sustainable here. And everybody had gardens and dairy cows and beef cattle. They produced what they needed themselves. The railroads, said Gilbert Lathrop, were little engines run by big men. And the narrow gauges pioneered in railroad science. And a narrow gauge railroad, and you're looking at the Rio Grande right near Crested Butte's bench back in the 1880s with the mountain in the background. Narrow gauge railroads had tracks that were 3 feet wide. Broad gauge, 4 feet, 8.5. And the narrow gauges were very utilitarian in the mountains because they could go up steeper grades, around sharper curves, and be built for less money, and most importantly, get into the mining camps first. They pioneered in railroad science, flangers, narrow gauges themselves, snow sheds, helper engines, and 30-pound rails. Many were the stories told about the narrow gauge railroads. On time, anytime, they said. You never wanted a railroad to run over you because it was on you for so long. And it doubles in, it doubles out, leaving the traveler still in doubt whether the engine on the track is going on or coming back. When the railroads left, the Denver South Park was done. It used to run through the Alpine Tunnel. That shut down in 1910. And there's a good example of the Rio Grande near Marshall Pass during a heavy snow year. Marshall Pass between Poncha Springs and Sargent's brought it into the Gunnison country in 1881. The Rio Grande tracks were pulled up in 1955, and the Gunnison country and Crested Butte suffered economically and psychologically. One of the great stories told about the narrow gauges was a fellow named Finnegan, who was in charge of writing up a report whenever a wreck occurred. And a wreck occurred just south of Crested Butte in the 1880s. And Finnegan wrote up a 2-page report. And his boss said, I don't want to read a long report, boil it down. The next time a wreck occurs, boil it down. About 3 months later, another wreck, and this time Finnegan wrote a 1-page report. And his boss again said, too long, boil it down. 2 months later, another wreck, and Finnegan filed the following report. Off again, on again, gone again, Finnegan. That's about as short a report as you could write. The fourth key to understanding Crested Butte and the Gunnison country is the federal government. The federal government owns 80% of the land in the Gunnison country and about the same on the western slope and 35% of the land statewide. In the past, the federal government set the price of gold and silver, owned the land that pioneers squatted on, gave Indian protection, subsidized railroad traffic and stage traffic, and subsidized water projects. In the old days, the government was looked upon as a friend, not an enemy. Then there was much land and very few people. Today, there's the same amount of land and a lot more people, and it's hard to satisfy everybody. Many more uses of the land today. Mountain bikes, skiing, grazing, rafting, fishing, hunting, dirt bikes, paddle boards. And the federal government can't be all things to all people. And today it's kind of considered an enemy, as opposed to the past where it was a great friend. The federal government is very important in Crested Butte and the Gunnison country today. It's got the BLM, Bureau of Land Management, Forest Service, Soil Conservation Service, United States Geological Survey, Park Service, Bureau of Reclamation, and the Bureau of Mines. And I would submit to all of you that any entity that owns 80% of an area can usually call the shots. And the federal government is very important today. The fifth key to understanding Crested Butte and the Gunnison country is mining. And there is the Horace Coal Mine, bituminous coal mine, south of Crested Butte. You can see where the mine is. You can see the tram that runs down and takes the coal into the tipple, and then it's loaded onto Denver and Rio Grande railroad cars and shipped out to the CF&I steel mills in Pueblo. This has always been a great mining area. And Crested Butte in the early days was known as the gateway to the Elk Mountains, the supply town, the railroad town, the smelter town, the jumping off point to the great silver towns around it like Irwin and Gothic and Tin Cup and Hidalgo and Obi Joyful and Pittsburgh. And there's some of the coal miners with a mule outside of the big mine. In the early 1880s, 25 to 40,000 people flocked into Crested Butte and the Gunnison country, living in every gulch, only here in the summer and the fall. And the great towns were silver towns were Pitkin, White Pine, Tin Cup, Gothic, and Irwin, each one with 2,000 to 4,000 people in. And Crested Butte, as I mentioned, was a great supply town. The silver boom ended in 1893, but Crested Butte then turned to its destiny, and its destiny was coal, and that's a little later lecture. There were 9 coal mines in and around Crested Butte, highlighted by the Jokerville mine, which blew up in 1884, killing 61 miners, and highlighted by the Big Mine, the 3rd biggest coal mine in Colorado on the bench. You're looking there at the Peanut Mine, which is located on the lower loop near the Slate River in 1927. And Peanut Lake is still there today. Today, Crested Butte and the surrounding area still has a lot of coal. Nearby Marble, the #1 rich molybdenum deposit in the world and the 4th largest on Red Lady Basin and Mount Emmons. And still a lot of gold and silver. We are one of the most versatile mining areas in Colorado and the nation. The 6th major key to understanding this area is the cattle industry. And the cattle industry goes all the way back to the 1870s. Now there's a good shot, June the 3rd, 1943. Kind of a wintry day, and they're driving sheep right down Elk Avenue in Crested Butte. June the 3rd. Cattle industry goes back to the days of Alonzo Hartman and Sylvester Richardson. And before that, Clyde Goodnight, the great Texas cattleman, had cattle in this area in the 1860s. Very early, there was a realization, kind of untrue, but thought to be true at the time, that you couldn't really farm in this area because of a 70-day growing season, too cold. And as a result, ranching took off, and ranchers did very well in the early years by providing beef to the mining camps. There's Lee Spann on horseback near Red Mountain in the 1970s. Spann ranches right around Jack's Cabin and west of Gunnison. The ranchers cleared off sagebrush and willows, very hard work. Dug irrigation ditches that led to the great hayfields of today. The elimination of the Ute Indians by the middle 1870s, the arrival of the railroads and cattle pools meant that cattle could get to markets cheaper than before, and new markets were now created. The first man ever to ship cattle out of the Western Slope was a Montrose rancher named William Booth, who did it in 1882. And the Gunnison country now became famous for some of the highest quality cattle, best bred cattle in the world. Dan Thornton, who had a ranch near Castle Mountain in his dispersal sale of 1949, sold 2 bulls for $50,000 each in 1949. The following year, Dan Thornton won the Republican nomination for governor and became Colorado governor from 1950 to 1954. There was a big cattle-sheep conflict in the Gunnison country and around Crested Butte, especially up around O.B. Joyful. 2 men were expelled from the Stock Growers Association because they owned 4 domestic sheep. An angry debate came, and Alonzo Hartman, the great cattleman, said, 4 can grow to 400. And when he was asked, have you ever eaten mutton? Hartman answered, yes, but I'm damned ashamed of it. Cattle ranching is the oldest continuous industry in the Gunnison country, and ranching is vital to our future today because of the land that the ranchers control. And some of the great ranches that we have in this area include Rosman, Molensic, Nikolai, Acre, and Span. And they were absolutely and are absolutely vital in controlling development in the area today. I love that shot. That's early 1950s. Welcome to Crested Butte. City limits slow up. And you can see Mount Emmons in the background, and you can see the water tank. And of course, the railroad was still running then. The 7th key to the understanding of the area around Crested Butte is tourism. Tourism is the 2nd largest industry in the state and one of the major economies of the Gunnison country and certainly Crested Butte. It's worth $15 million a year in the state. Skiing, hunting, fishing, mountain biking, 4-wheel drives. The Blue Mesa Reservoir is the 2nd largest tourist area in the state, behind that of Rocky Mountain National Park. 1.75 million tourists a year come in. The Black Canyon, 200,000. 350,000 skier days at the Crested Butte ski area. And then a lot of people coming in to hunt and fish and mountain bike and just see the scenery. Tourism, as you look at Crested Butte again, around the 1940s, tourism has always been important. The Denver Rio Grande had on the side of its car, Scenic Line of the West. Palmer Hoyt, editor of the Denver Post, always when the willow flies hatched out on the Gunnison River, he wanted his telegrapher at Iola to send a telegraph, and Palmer Hoyt was on the next train out. Springs also brought a lot of people in. Now, one important factor with regard to tourism that we got to maintain the air and the water quality and control growth. Tourism is big business. Great environment is absolutely essential to tourism. The 8th key to understanding Crested Butte in the Gunnison country is electricity. And a lot of people probably hear that and say, well, hell, everybody's got electricity, don't they? And the answer is no. Gunnison got it in 1882 from the Gas and Water Works. Crested Butte got it in 1889 from the Crested Butte Light and Power Company, sponsored by the CF&I and the big mine. But everybody else in between didn't get it until 1938 and after, because the electric companies couldn't make money on a sparsely populated area in between. And then Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal got the Rural Electric Association. And that led to the coming of electricity in the Gunnison country, and we got it in 1938. There was a proposed hydro plant near Peanut Lake in 1941. It was going to use coal and slate to power 2 335 horsepower generators. But then World War II intervened. And electricity became big business when a guy named Nikola Tesla came up with alternating current electricity. And in Telluride in 1891, a little power plant called Ames found out how to run electricity long distances. That's a little later story. But Ames today is world famous because that is where 4 miles out of Telluride, the first use of alternating current electricity occurred in history. The ninth key to understanding Crested Butte is natural resources. Around this area, we had a lot of gold and silver and molybdenum and marble. And of course, tremendous anthracite coal, tremendous bituminous coal, and tremendous coking coal. Water is another resource we have. Timber is another resource that we had. Scenery and sunshine, and you're looking at Angel Pass, high above Obie Joyful and Poverty Gulch, and a bunch of backcountry skiers in the 1980s getting ready to ski the wonderful snow. The scenery has brought a lot of people in to see the 14,000 footers, the Elk Mountains, the great flower garden, and the great clear blue skies. Those are the great keys to the understanding of the Gunnison country. And now, when I gave you all these keys to understanding, and there's the Crested Butte Snowshoe Club. They called them snowshoes, even there were skis in 1886. So now you know the keys to understanding this area. But now I want to tell you a little story about those keys. A long time ago, when the Muslim civilization was number one in the world, and Baghdad was probably the number one city in the world, this story was told. A man who was called the Master sent his servant into Baghdad to stock up on supplies for the next couple of months, something he had done many times before. The servant returned very early with no supplies. And the master said, "How come you're back early, and where are the supplies?" And the servant said, "I have been accosted by death in the marketplace. I got to leave Baghdad. I'm going to Samura," which was a neighboring town about 20 miles away. And the master said, "Well, you go to Samura, but I'm going into Baghdad and find out what in the hell happened." And he went into Baghdad and he found death in the marketplace. And the master said to Death, "Why did you jostle and threaten my servant in the marketplace?" And Death replied, "I did not jostle or threaten your servant in the marketplace. I merely expressed great surprise that he would be here in Baghdad today when I've got an appointment with him in Samura tomorrow." Now you can go online and pull up appointment in Samura. But that is the X factor. That is the unknown. Nobody knows what's going to happen in the future. And there are things we don't know about today that will come up in the future and have a big impact on Crested Butte and the surrounding area. As I conclude, I'm going to tell you a little story about a great writer named Eugene Field, who wrote for the Denver Post. Eugene Field was a writer for the Denver Post during the big boom of mining, and he used to spend a lot of time up above Boulder at a mining camp called Gold Hill, and he would drink beer and whiskey with miners at the Wentworth Hotel. And then he was transferred to New York, and when he came back, the boom had busted, and he went up to the Wentworth Hotel, and there wasn't anybody there, and the hotel was falling into ruin. And Eugene Field lamented with a brilliant poem called Casey's Table Dope, which went something like this. "Oh, them days on Red Hoss Mountain when the skies was fair and blue, when the money flowed like liquor and the folks was brave and true, when the nights was crisp and balmy and the camp was all astir, with the joints all throwed wide open and no sheriff to demur. Oh, them days on Red Hoss Mountain, in the Rockies far away. There's no such place nor time like them as I can find today. What, though the camp is busted, I seem to see it still, a lion like I love it, on the big and warty hill. And I feel a sort of yearning and a choking in my throat when I think of Red Hoss Mountain and Casey's Table D'oh. And I think that's the same type of thing that we feel about the great town of Crested Butte and the Elk Mountains and the Slate River and the East River and Mount Teocalli and that wonderful scenery that we have around here. And that's it.